Welcome and thank you for joining us this morning for the second of our 5-part Turn the Page STL webinar series, our Community Needs Assessment. My name is Lisa Graining and I'm the project manager of Turn the Page STL. A few housekeeping details before we begin. Please introduce yourself in the chat box. All happy shout outs and welcomes are encouraged. All webinar attendees who are participating, you guys are in listen-only mode during this webinar to avoid background noises or any other distractions. However, we highly encourage you to actively engage with your thoughts, ideas in the chat box. And if you have any questions for the presenters, please type them in the Q&A box. Kylie Bednar with UMSL has joined us again, and she will be responding to your chats and questions. Also, this webinar will be recorded today, and a link will be sent to you via email next week, including the slide deck and other resources that we discussed today. Also, at the end of the webinar, there will be a short poll, and we hope you will provide us with feedback to help us improve our webinar series. Now on to our webinar, Quantitative Data and Racial Inequity in Third Grade Reading Proficiency. I will begin this webinar with a discussion of the quantitative facts about third grade reading proficiency in the St. Louis community. Then, Mr. Julius B. Anthony, founder and president of St. Louis Black Authors of Children's Literature, will discuss the history of educating Black children in St. Louis and a real experience of a Black student attending school here. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment of silence in memory of George Floyd and all who've experienced murder and injustice in our country and in St. Louis simply because of the color of their skin. Thank you. Before we begin to discuss how to improve third grade reading proficiency in our community, St. Louis, we need to know the basic facts. At the end of third grade, all students in the state of Missouri take the MAP test exam. It's the Missouri Assessment Program exam on both English language arts and mathematics. We begin by looking at third grade reading scores for our lowest performing school districts that are in the Promise Zone schools. Those are included Ferguson-Florissant School District, and these are in alphabetical order. Hazelwood School District, Jennings School District, Normandy Schools Collaborative, Riverview Gardens School District, St. Louis Public Schools, and University City Public Schools. This shows the percentage of children in those districts who pass the MAP test in English language arts, specifically the percentage of children who score at the proficient or advanced level. So in Ferguson-Florissant School District, 26.9% of students passed the English language arts exam at the end of third grade. In Hazelwood School District, it was 34.9%. Jennings School District, 26%, and Normandy Schools Collaborative, 16.9%. Riverview Gardens, 12.8%. St. Louis Public Schools, 19.1%. and University City Public Schools, 41.1. We also looked at our charter schools in the city of St. Louis. Much different picture, much different demographically we'll get into later. City Garden Montessori, you will see is at 75.9% passed. Also Gateway Science Academy, 55.4% passed. But as you look at Confluence Schools, 11.8. Eagle College Prep, 24.7% passed. KIPP, 25.7% passed. And Premier, 28.8% passed. By the way, the state of Missouri, on average, only 48.7% of kids pass the MAP test. Then we wanted to look at higher income districts, you know, the ones that have all the money. And we wanted to see what were the percentages of, and I wrote this mostly higher income, of students were reading proficiently by the end of third grade. It's not great news at all. In Clayton, which had the highest percentage, 76.8% of students. That means 23% are not able to pass the MAP test grade at the end of third grade. Other school districts, you'll notice we looked at Rittner, who's not part of the Promise Zone school district, but has lower property tax values, and they're down at 28.7%. In poor districts with higher percentage of African American students, reading proficiency levels were the lowest. So Turn the Page STL took it one step further and looked at the percentage of African American students in all of the schools reading proficiently by the end of third grade. The risk factor for these students? Racism and poverty. You will see in here, University City Public Schools, as we noted before, 41.1% of their students are reading at grade level by the end of third grade. 80% of their student body is Black, and of that, 30.5% of Black students were reading proficiently by the end of third grade. This is a trend you will see across the board. St. Louis Public Schools, 19.1% of the students were reading at grade level. 79% of the Black students are in the district, but when you just look at the Black students in the district, 11.9% of them are passing. Normandy Schools Collaborative, Riverview Gardens and Jennings School District, all with almost 100% African American students. Still, African American students perform lower. We also looked at charter schools, very interesting data. And compared with the Promise Zone school districts, it looks kind of similar. The higher the percentage of African American students attending a charter school, like Confluence or Eagle Prep or KIPP, the lower the percentage of students reading proficiently. There are two primary exceptions I wanted to note. Northside Community School has a high percentage of African American students, 95%, and a high reading proficiency rate of 48%. On the other side, 26.3% of students at Premier Charter School are African American, yet only 28.8% of the students are reading proficiently. 3 charter schools, St. Louis Language Immersion School, City Garden Montessori, and Carondelet Leadership Academy, have on average an African American student population of about 50%. St. Louis Language Immersion School and Carondelet both have students reading proficiently about the same level, 38.1 and 34.6. City Garden, however, has 75.9% of the students reading proficiently, the highest between all the Promise Zone school districts and charter schools. And then when we took it out even further, as noted, as you can see above, even in wealthier districts, African Americans are reading less proficiently and at much lower rates than their white peers. In districts with a higher percentage of African American students, like Rittner, 41.7%, only 28.7% of students are reading proficiently. However, in some wealthier districts, African American students are performing much higher than their peers in lower performing districts. So in African American students who attend Clayton, 55% of the students are reading proficiently by the end of third grade. Francis Howell, 47.7, and Ladue, 43.5, and Bayless, 42.8. But in all of the wealthier districts noted above, the percentage of African American students reading proficiently compared to their classroom peers is lower. The percentage of African American students reading proficiently in Rockwood, 20.9, Melville, 25.5, and Webster Groves, 29.4, is among the lowest, and as low as the scores of African American students who attend Promise Zone school districts. We argue that our current educational system in St. Louis is not teaching enough of our African American students to read proficiently. So now we get to hear from a good friend of mine, Mr. Julius B. Anthony. He's the founder and president of St. Louis Black Authors of Children's Literature. He's got a long line of work in the public school and charter school system and independent school system in St. Louis. And I invite you to check out St. Louis Black Authors of Children's Literature and follow them on Facebook. And Julius, I welcome you to begin and tell us the story behind these numbers.
So good morning to everyone that's out there. Good morning, Lisa. Thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to have this conversation. I guess what I'd like to share first, since your presentation was basically around the data, I'd like to share just basically what the average readability rate is for Black children within the St. Louis metropolitan region, so that we can all just get a more direct look or consideration of what Black children are. So essentially, based on all the data that you share, we know that 70 to 75% of Black children within the St. Louis metropolitan region annually fail the state mandated third grade test in reading. We know that to be true. And this isn't something that's new. This has been happening for generations, but we definitely know that it's been happening since we've been collecting this data under No Child Left Behind. We also know that based on US Census data, that historically 90% of children, Black children, and in the St. Louis metropolitan region traditionally will attend a public school. That's where they will primarily get their education, and we know that to be true now. We also know that most children, Black or white, attend school within their neighborhoods, okay? And we also know that basically historically, St. Louis has been built around ethnic and cultural neighborhoods. And once you become a part of that neighborhood experience, generations tend to live in that same area. And a lot of that has to do with city ordinances around housing and where people are allowed to purchase a house and live. As a matter of fact, historically in St. Louis, as it relates to public education, most African Americans lived in North City. If we look at the Great Migration from the 20s all the way up to the mid-50s, when Blacks were migrating from the South to the North, those that landed in St. Louis landed in North City. And that's where their children were educated. Blacks typically did not move out into the county area or the county districts until the 70s. And there's a whole rationale on who were those Blacks that moved out to the county and their ability and capability to get housing out in those areas. But just historically, we have always been in communities that primarily people that we lived around looked like us and acted like us. So in terms of just looking at another historical perspective in terms of public education in North City, traditionally, the St. Louis public schools in the past had two separate districts. So they had a district that was ran in North City, and they had a district that was ran in South City. And the district in North City was called the Banneker, I can remember, it was Banneker something school district, and that's where primarily Black children attended. Now, just considering that, we then know that public education in the St. Louis metropolitan area has always been separate and never equal, ever equal. And we're looking at the totality of education in this city. But when we look at reading and literacy specifically, then what we have to look at, not just in terms of where Black children are attending or the building that they're attending in or the neighborhood, we have to look at the curriculum that our children are participating in. We have to look at how are we teaching reading, what's the standard for teaching reading, and what is the process that we are upholding as the standard, okay? And so we know that when we teach reading, the core of teaching reading comes in two forms. We're looking at explicit instruction, where we're trying to teach skill sets. And in this new age, we're looking at what the International Literacy Association determines reading is, which they say there are 6 elements to literacy: looking, listening, speaking, visual expression, reading, and writing. And there's all kind of explicit instruction that we build around those concepts in order for children to become fully literate. When we look at reading, we're looking at 5 elements of reading. So we're looking at phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and then comprehension. Now, at the core of that, separate from the explicit instruction, what we have is the text that we use in order to teach the explicit instruction. And we look at the text, then we're looking at information that primarily isn't culturally relevant. What does that mean? That simply means that the information that children are being presented as it relates to the kinds of things that they are asked to read do not tell stories about who they are, do not include characters that reflect who they are, do not include books that include images of who they are. And we know that this is true based on information that we also get from the International Literacy Association that suggests that less than 6% of the text that all children get in American public education tell stories about the Black experience. And I think that that's the real conversation around children performing well, particularly Black children performing well around reading. It's about interest. It's about a connection to the information that we're giving children in schools. And so consider this. Consider a Black child that's attending one of the Promise Zone community schools. And let's just understand that those particular school districts were given that designation as a result of the economic conditions in those communities. So the Promise Zone community is a federal designation and is designated as a result of a community that's receiving a majority, where kids are receiving or attending a school that has a high level of free and reduced lunch identified kids, okay? And most of the school districts in the Promise Zone communities are getting at least 70 to 80% Title I services, which is based on free and reduced lunch, or they're receiving 100% Title I services. And we also, getting back to that other statistic, around 90% of Black children attending schools in those school districts basically says to us that the majority of Black children then are growing up in poverty, or they're living in a household that we would consider a working class household, which is also considered the working poor. So consider a kid in those communities, in those neighborhoods, growing up in a house in that neighborhood where there is pervasive low income. You know, where there perhaps is a father in the home or may not be in the home, where the mother could be a single mother, or a kid is growing up being raised by a grandparent, limited food in the community, poor housing. And that kid has to wake up every morning with our community expectation that they will go to school and learn, that they will go to school and get the things that we expect for them to know so that they can become productive citizens. Because that's the general thinking in the education community, that American public schools will shape you in such a way that when you leave this experience, you are a productive citizen. So you have this kid growing up in a community that is that has insidious poverty, and not just in the household that they're growing up in, but with all the households around them. And if you ever grew up in or been to North City, you know what that looks like. If you go to North County and places like Ferguson, Jennings, Riverview, you know what that looks like. You go into the school building, and the moment you walk into that building, the pervasive thinking from the adults in that building is to make sure that you are controlled throughout the day. That the only thing you do in this building is what I tell you to do. The only information that you get in this building is the information that I give you. And the information that I say to you is important for you. Okay, no free thinking, no real analytical reasoning, all those skills that we say that kids really need in order to be productive adults. You go into this classroom, you have a teacher, and now in St. Louis, most of the teachers aren't going to look like you. And they're not going to live in communities that you live in. And this teacher has this curriculum that they're mandated to facilitate. It's not a curriculum that they've created, it's a curriculum that was given to them. And in that curriculum, rarely, whether it's math, science, social studies, or reading, rarely do you hear anything that's really reflective of your experiences or your background knowledge, and you're expected to get it just like that. You've never been to an ocean or been to, you've never even been to the Arch or have even seen the Mississippi River. Because the majority of your life is really based around the 4 blocks that you live in. But you're expected to know all of these things and have all of this knowledge and be tested on it, not just at the end of the year, but throughout the year, because we have a testing system where we do progress monitoring, right? And so essentially, when you're in this space as a kid, and I just want to add this, I'm not sharing with you something that I read. I'm sharing with you my own experience as well, because I grew up in the Jeff Vanderloo community, the 63106 zip code area. And if anybody knows anything about Jeff Vanderloo, we all know Jeff Vanderloo back in the day and today has always had the highest risk levels for any citizen in metropolitan St. Louis, in any area: health, education, nutrition. We had all the high risk. And so I know what it's like to grow up in a community where you're expected to achieve, but you're not really given all the tools that you need to really achieve. So you get into these spaces, in these classrooms, you're given all this information, but essentially you're rendered invisible. You're rendered invisible. It's as if really the system doesn't really see you. The only thing you get in this system is what we expect you to get. It's not built off of your experiences. It's not built off of your experiences even in poverty. It's built off of some other kind of system that we believe is better. And the whole goal is to get you from your poverty experience to this whole idea of what we might believe is better. And so to me, it's complex. Mm-hmm. There's a whole lot of variables that go into why Black children aren't reading at the end of 3rd grade. But one particular area that we have not given good consideration to is the information and the text and the curriculum that we present to them. Teachers might be skilled in the strategies for teaching reading, But if the text, it doesn't connect with the student, then the student is still rendered invisible and less likely to connect to the reading process. You have to love reading to do well at it.
Mhm.
And so we're not creating a system that helps children to fall in love with reading, then we're doing them a big disservice. And all we're doing is perpetuating a race-based system. We teach race in education. We teach racial inequity in education by the mere fact we don't give Black children an opportunity to see themselves in the curriculum and the literature.
Julius, thank you for the real facts, more than the data facts. I know that there's going to be a lot of questions, and I want everyone to understand that Julius and I and Kylie, we are giving you the problem over these next 5 webinar series. We're giving you the problem, and we will be inviting you in July to help us figure out how to solve the problem. But right now, we all need a basis of understanding the problem. And I thank you, Julius, thank you for talking and really, truly telling us much of the facts across the board in St. Louis. I know we did want to make sure this was 30 minutes. If you have a question, we have 3 minutes left. You are welcome to ask them. You are also welcome to ask me at lisa.graining@turnthepagestl.org. If it's a question that Julius would better answer, or Kylie, I will pass that on to them. We will continue to learn for the next 3 webinar sessions. Next week, Kylie Bednar with the UMSL Community Innovation and Action Center will be talking with us about what the community told us in our 8 focus groups that we had conducted over the winter. What the families are saying, what the teachers are saying, early educators all the way up through 3rd grade teachers. In session 4, we're going to be diving into 2 of the 5 factors that lead kindergarten readiness and family engagement to not being reading by the end of 3rd grade. Session 5 will dive into teacher preparedness, summer learning, and attendance. And like I said, these 5 webinars are part of the data collection process here. And in July, we will be inviting all of you to figure out what are those root causes that Julius taught us, that the data is showing us, that the factors are showing us, and how can we get to those root causes and alleviate them. I want to thank you. I see Allison Gee from Parents as Teachers asked, can Mr. Anthony talk about what his organization is doing regarding the problem he described? So what is St. Louis Black Authors? Why don't we end? That's a wonderful way to end. Julius, what are you doing with St. Louis Black Authors to alleviate this crisis?
And so what we're doing is attempting to change the trajectory for Black children around reading proficiency. Our core mission is simply to ensure that all children are confident and competent readers by the end of 3rd grade. And this is how we are planning to do that. Our core program is called the Believe Project. In that project, we are building literacy labs in community centers and schools that focus on Black children having opportunities to have consistent access to Black children's literature. So in those spaces, we have at least 1,000 books. In the spaces that we currently have open, we have more than 3,500 books. 80% of those books are Black children's literature as we define it. In addition to that, we have these partnerships that continue to help children to build skills. And so we have 5 core partners: Scholastic Book Fairs, 9 Network and PBS Kids, IKEA, Ready Readers, and We Stories. And they are helping to support the work that we're doing in these spaces. 9 Network and their Ready to Learn program is an experiential program for young children. They get free books out of this experience, and they also get opportunities to fall in love with literacy. Our children also get visits from our authors, who are all local authors who have published. They get at least 4 visits from those authors every year. And all children get copies of their literature. And we bring in national authors, primarily through our relationship with Scholastic, so that our children can get to see an author. We know that in most schools that Black children attend, they rarely get to see an author. And in our school system, we look at the author as the God, because the author is the person that puts the knowledge in the book. And so we want our children to have connection and conversation with authors. And so we give all the children that participate in our project opportunities to do that. Right now, we're working on a literacy-based children's show that will be piloted this summer. It's a remote learning virtual experience. We will be premiering it on the 9 Network's YouTube channel. We'll release more information about that coming. That is a project that is being funded through the Opportunity Trust, and we're really excited about that. But the goal is to build this idea of more Black children getting access to Black children's literature, because we think that's a definitive strategy for improving reading instruction for Black children.
Fantastic, Julius. We love your work. I did put a poll up just to get a sense of our webinar and how we can improve it. Please take a few seconds to complete the poll. And I really look forward to seeing all of you again next Tuesday at 11 a.m. You will be getting a recording of this today or tomorrow, along with the slide deck, and you're welcome to share what we discussed today with any of your colleagues. We want to all be on the, sorry guys, same page before we dive into how we can find the resources and change our educational landscape so that all children in the St. Louis community are reading proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. Thank you all for joining us.